People often believe that a princess is born inside a palace, but sometimes she is simply a kind heart waiting for someone to remind her who she has always been. On a chilly Saturday morning in Charleston, Savannah Brooks stood quietly inside a small bridal boutique, staring at the last wedding dress hanging alone in the corner. It was not the beautiful white gown displayed in the front window. It had been marked down several times, and a tiny tag attached to the sleeve read "Final Sale." The lace around the shoulders was simple, and the design was far older than the fashionable styles the other customers admired. Two young women nearby looked at the dress, then at Savannah, before whispering to each other with quiet laughter. Savannah pretended not to notice. She had learned long ago that some people looked at clothes before they looked at a person. She worked 6 days a week at a neighborhood bakery, helping her grandmother pay the bills after her grandfather passed away. Every dollar mattered. Fancy dresses belonged to other people who arrived in expensive cars and carried polished handbags. Savannah picked up the old dress and gently touched the fabric. It reminded her of something her grandmother always said. The prettiest flowers are not the ones everyone notices first. They are the ones that keep blooming after the storm. The elderly owner of the boutique walked over and smiled kindly. "It has been here almost a year," she said. "No one ever chooses it." Savannah looked at herself in the mirror while holding the dress against her shoulders. She did not see someone beautiful. She saw a woman with tired eyes from early mornings at the bakery, simple clothes that had been carefully repaired more than once, and hands that carried the marks of hard work. Still, something about the old dress made her smile. "I think it deserves a chance," she whispered. The owner helped her into the fitting room. A few minutes later, Savannah stepped out wearing the gown. The shop grew strangely quiet. Even the two women who had laughed before stopped talking. The dress fit her almost perfectly, as though someone had created it just for her many years earlier. Savannah looked into the mirror but quickly lowered her eyes again. She still could not see what everyone else was beginning to notice. Outside the boutique, a long black car slowly stopped at the curb. Ethan Calloway, the youngest billionaire chief executive officer in the state, had been driving his grandmother to a medical appointment nearby. While waiting for the traffic light to change, the elderly woman happened to glance through the boutique window. She reached forward and touched her grandson's arm. "There," she said softly. Ethan followed her gaze. Standing beneath the soft lights of the little shop was a young woman wearing a forgotten wedding dress, looking at herself with uncertainty instead of pride. His grandmother smiled gently. "That girl reminds me of your grandfather when he first met me. The world told him I was ordinary, but he always said ordinary people carry extraordinary hearts." Ethan looked at Savannah for only a few seconds before the light turned green and the car moved away. He never learned her name that day. Savannah never noticed the car outside the window. Yet somewhere between the old dress, the quiet mirror, and the stranger passing by, destiny had already begun writing a story that neither of them could possibly imagine. Back inside the boutique, Savannah carefully changed into her old clothes and folded the dress one last time. Before leaving, she turned toward the mirror again. For a brief moment, she thought she saw someone stronger staring back at her. Then the image disappeared, and she quietly walked out into the cool Charleston morning, carrying nothing except a small bakery apron and a dream she had almost forgotten she was allowed to have. Savannah Brooks believed that life usually moved in small circles. Every morning before sunrise, she unlocked the doors of the neighborhood bakery, mixed fresh dough, arranged warm bread behind the glass counter, and hurried home before dark to help her grandmother with dinner. She never imagined that a single afternoon could completely change the direction of her future. 3 days after visiting the bridal boutique, Savannah received an unexpected phone call. The elderly owner of the shop spoke with unusual excitement. "A lady came looking for you," she said. "She said she met you only for a second, but she hopes you will agree to have tea with her." Savannah almost laughed. Nobody ever searched for her. She assumed there had been some mistake, but curiosity finally convinced her to accept the invitation. The address led her to an old family estate sitting on a quiet hill outside Charleston. The house was elegant without feeling distant, surrounded by oak trees and gardens that looked as though they had been cared for over many generations. An older woman welcomed Savannah at the front door with a warm smile that immediately made her feel comfortable. "My name is Eleanor Calloway," she said. "Thank you for coming." They spent the afternoon talking about simple things. Eleanor asked about the bakery, about Savannah's grandmother, and about the dreams she had as a little girl. Nobody had asked her questions like that in years. Most people only noticed her work clothes or the flower that always seemed to find its way onto her sleeves. Before leaving, Savannah finally gathered the courage to ask why she had been invited. Eleanor reached into a small wooden box beside her chair and removed an old photograph. It showed a young couple standing outside a tiny grocery store many decades earlier. "That was my husband and me," she explained. "Everyone told him he should marry someone richer, prettier, and more important. But he always said that kindness was the rarest beauty in the world." Savannah listened quietly. Eleanor smiled and gently took her hand. "When I looked through that bridal shop window, I saw the same kindness in your eyes." A few moments later, the front door opened and Ethan Calloway walked inside after finishing a business meeting in the city. He stopped when he saw Savannah sitting beside his grandmother. She immediately recognized him as the man from the black car outside the boutique, although she had only caught a brief glimpse that day. Ethan greeted her politely and sat down. Eleanor looked from one to the other with a knowing smile. "I have one final wish," she said softly. "I want to see my grandson married before I leave this world." Savannah lowered her eyes, believing the conversation could not possibly involve her. Ethan looked surprised as well. Eleanor continued speaking. "I do not care about money or social circles. I care about character. And I believe both of you have good hearts." Silence filled the room. Ethan slowly looked toward Savannah. There was no arrogance in his expression, only sincerity. "My grandmother has spoken about you every day since she saw you," he admitted. "I know this sounds impossible, but would you consider helping me make her wish come true?" Savannah could hardly believe what she was hearing. She was a baker who worried about grocery bills, and he was one of the most successful businessmen in the country. Yet as she looked into his eyes, she saw the same quiet loneliness that sometimes stared back at her from the mirror. Outside, the evening sun settled behind the old oak trees while the forgotten wedding dress remained hanging quietly inside the little boutique across town, waiting for the moment destiny would finally call it home. Savannah Brooks spent the next several days wondering whether the conversation at the Calloway estate had really happened or whether she had simply imagined it during one of her long mornings at the bakery. Every loaf of bread she placed on the shelves and every cake she decorated seemed to carry the same impossible question. Why would a man like Ethan Calloway choose someone like her? She had grown up believing that people from different worlds could smile at each other, but they could never truly belong together. Meanwhile, Ethan found himself thinking about the quiet young woman his grandmother had invited into their lives. He had attended elegant galas, met celebrities, and worked with powerful business leaders across the country. Yet very few people had ever spoken to his grandmother with the gentle patience Savannah showed that afternoon. She had listened more than she talked. She had treated Eleanor not as the founder of one of the wealthiest families in the state, but simply as an elderly woman who wanted company. One evening, Ethan returned to the bakery just before closing time. The little shop smelled of cinnamon and fresh bread, and Savannah was carefully wiping flour from the counter. She looked surprised when she saw him standing at the door. Ethan smiled politely. "I was hoping we could talk." They sat together at a small table near the window while the last sunlight of the day settled across the quiet street outside. Ethan spoke honestly. "My grandmother's health has been changing, and seeing her happy means more to me than any business deal I have ever signed. I know her idea sounds unusual. I am not asking for forever. I am only asking if you would consider a simple marriage agreement that gives her peace." Savannah looked down at her hands. She should have felt insulted, but strangely she did not. Ethan's voice carried no pride and no sense of superiority. He seemed almost as uncertain as she was. "Why me?" she finally whispered. Ethan thought about the question for a long moment. Then he answered with complete honesty. "Because when my grandmother looked through that shop window, she saw someone good. And after meeting you, I think she was right." A few days later, Savannah visited the Calloway estate again. Eleanor welcomed her into a quiet sitting room where an old wooden chest rested beside the fireplace. The elderly woman opened it and carefully removed a folded wedding dress wrapped in soft fabric. Savannah immediately recognized it. It was the same forgotten dress from the little boutique. Eleanor smiled as surprise filled the young woman's face. "Your grandfather bought this dress for me when we had almost nothing," she explained. "After he passed away, I asked the boutique owner to keep it safe until the right person came along. Savannah gently touched the lace with trembling fingers. You knew? Eleanor nodded. The moment I saw you wearing it. Tears slowly gathered in Savannah's eyes. Nobody had ever chosen her before. Not because of what she owned or how she looked, but simply because they believed she had a good heart. A week later, under the old oak trees behind the family estate, a small private ceremony was arranged. There were no television cameras, no famous guests, and no grand celebration. Savannah wore the same simple dress that nobody else had wanted. Ethan stood beside her in a dark suit, while Eleanor watched with quiet happiness from the front row. As Savannah looked toward the small mirror placed near the garden path, she still saw the same ordinary young woman from the bakery. She had no idea that this quiet beginning would one day change not only her own life, but also the hearts of everyone who had ever underestimated her. The first weeks after the wedding felt like stepping into a world Savannah Brooks had only ever seen in magazines. The Calloway estate was larger than the entire neighborhood where she had grown up. Marble floors reflected the morning sunlight, paintings covered the walls, and long dining tables seemed prepared for guests who never came. Yet despite all the beauty surrounding her, Savannah often felt smaller than she had inside the little bakery. She woke up before everyone else each morning and quietly walked into the enormous kitchen to make fresh biscuits using her grandmother's recipe. The house staff would always smile and thank her, but many of the people connected to the Calloway family looked at her differently. They saw a baker who had somehow found her way into a billionaire's home. At Ethan's first family gathering after the wedding, Savannah wore a simple blue dress she had chosen because it reminded her of the ocean near Charleston. The other women arrived wearing expensive designer gowns and sparkling jewelry. As Savannah entered the ballroom beside Ethan, quiet conversations seemed to stop for just a second before continuing in low whispers. Vanessa Calloway, Ethan's elegant cousin, stepped forward with a practiced smile. She looked Savannah up and down before speaking. I heard you worked in a bakery. That must have been charming. Savannah simply nodded. I loved it. Vanessa smiled politely, but the people standing nearby quietly laughed. Well, I suppose every family needs a good cook. Ethan heard the comment immediately. Before Savannah could answer, he calmly took her hand and led her toward the center of the room. Actually, he said with complete confidence, my wife is the kindest person I have ever met. I consider myself very fortunate. The room grew quiet again. Savannah looked at him with surprise. Nobody had ever defended her like that before. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home, Savannah stood alone in one of the long hallways of the estate. Along the walls hung enormous mirrors framed in gold. She stopped in front of one and looked at her reflection. The expensive house, the elegant dress, and the sparkling lights had changed nothing. She still saw the same ordinary young woman who had once stood inside a tiny bridal boutique wearing a forgotten dress. Ethan quietly walked up behind her. He did not speak right away. Instead, he stood beside her and looked into the same mirror. Do you know what I see? He asked softly. Savannah lowered her eyes. Someone who does not belong here. Ethan slowly shook his head. I see someone who belongs anywhere she chooses to stand. The next morning, he asked her to follow him to a quiet part of the estate she had never visited before. Hidden behind an old wooden door was a beautiful circular room surrounded completely by mirrors from floor to ceiling. Sunlight entered through the glass roof above, filling the room with warmth. Savannah looked around in confusion. What is this place? Ethan smiled gently. My grandmother calls it the mirror room. She says every member of our family comes here once in life to discover who they really are. Savannah looked at the countless reflections surrounding her. No matter where she turned, she still saw the same woman. Ethan stepped beside her and quietly spoke the words that would stay in her heart forever. I am not going to change the way you look. The only thing I want to change is the way you see yourself. After leaving the mirror room, Savannah Brooks found herself thinking about Ethan's words every day. He had never asked her to become someone else. He never criticized the way she dressed, the way she spoke, or the simple habits she had carried since childhood. Instead, he quietly encouraged her to discover parts of herself she had never believed were there. One afternoon, Eleanor invited Savannah into the old library at the Calloway estate. Tall shelves filled with books reached all the way to the ceiling, and sunlight poured through large windows overlooking the gardens. Eleanor placed several books on the table. Some were about art, some about business, and others told the stories of remarkable women who had changed their communities through kindness rather than power. Beauty fades, Eleanor said gently, but a thoughtful heart and a curious mind become more beautiful every year. Savannah began spending a little time in the library each day. She learned about history, charity work, and the family foundation that had helped schools and hospitals across the state for decades. She asked questions without feeling embarrassed, and Ethan always answered with patience. Sometimes they would walk through the gardens together while discussing ideas for helping small businesses in local neighborhoods. Savannah often talked about the little bakery where she had worked and the families who struggled to keep their dreams alive. Ethan listened carefully because he realized she understood ordinary people in ways that expensive consultants never could. A few weeks later, Eleanor asked Savannah to attend a charity luncheon at the Callaway Foundation. The event would bring together local teachers, volunteers, and community leaders. Savannah immediately became nervous. She remembered the family gathering where people had quietly laughed at her simple background. Ethan noticed the worry in her eyes and walked with her to the mirror room once again. The afternoon light filled the circular room, reflecting endless images around them. Savannah looked at her own reflection and sighed softly. "I still feel like the girl from the bakery." Ethan smiled. "Good. That girl worked hard, cared for her grandmother, and never stopped being kind. She is exactly the person this world needs." On the day of the luncheon, Savannah chose a modest cream-colored dress instead of one of the expensive outfits that had been prepared for her. She wore the same simple necklace her grandmother had given her years before. As she entered the hall, she noticed people watching her, and for a moment the old uncertainty returned. Then an elderly school principal approached her with a warm smile. "Mrs. Callaway," she said, "I heard you used to work in a bakery. My students would love to learn how small dreams can become big ones." Savannah spent the afternoon speaking with teachers, volunteers, and children instead of standing with wealthy guests. She listened to their stories, shared her own experiences, and laughed more freely than she had since joining the Callaway family. When the event ended, several people thanked her for making them feel seen and appreciated. Vanessa watched everything from across the room. She had expected Savannah to embarrass herself, but instead she had become the most talked about person at the gathering. That evening, as the sun disappeared beyond the gardens, Savannah walked alone back into the mirror room. She stood quietly before the glass and looked at the reflection staring back at her. The same dark curls, the same gentle eyes, and the same simple smile remained. Nothing about her appearance had changed. Yet for the first time in her life, she did not wish she looked like someone else. Behind her, Ethan quietly entered the room and saw the small smile on her face. Without saying a word, he realized that the transformation had already begun, not because she had become a princess, but because she was finally learning to believe that she had always been enough. Autumn arrived quietly in Charleston, covering the old oak trees around the Callaway estate with shades of gold and amber. For Savannah Brooks, the changing season seemed to mirror the changes happening inside her own heart. She still woke early each morning and sometimes baked bread with the kitchen staff simply because it reminded her of home, but now she also spent her afternoons working with the Callaway Foundation. She visited local schools, listened to struggling business owners, and helped organize reading programs for children whose families could not afford books. The more time she spent meeting ordinary people, the more she realized that her own experiences allowed her to understand them in a way that many wealthy donors could not. Ethan rarely told her what to do. Instead, he quietly stood beside her and watched her confidence grow. One afternoon, he invited her to walk through the city with him without security guards or formal schedules. They visited the old neighborhood where the bakery stood. Savannah smiled as she greeted former customers who still remembered her by name. The owner of the bakery hugged her warmly and pointed toward a little girl standing near the window. "She wants to become a baker someday," the woman whispered. The child looked shyly at Savannah and asked, "How did you become a princess?" Savannah looked surprised before kneeling to meet her eyes. "I did not become a princess," she answered softly. "I just learned that being kind is something nobody can take away from you." Ethan stood a few steps away and listened in silence. Later that evening, he realized that his grandmother had been right all along. The woman standing beside him had never needed to change. She had only needed the chance to believe in herself. A few days later, Eleanor announced that the annual Callaway Foundation Gala would take place at the end of the month. It was the largest charitable event of the year, bringing together business leaders, artists, teachers, and community volunteers from across the state. Vanessa immediately offered to organize the evening, secretly hoping Savannah would feel out of place in front of such an important crowd. The preparations filled the estate with activity. Designers arrived with elegant gowns, jewelers delivered sparkling collections, and stylists filled entire rooms with possibilities. Savannah looked at everything with quiet uncertainty. One evening she stood alone inside the mirror room, surrounded by endless reflections once again. Ethan found her there holding the simple cream-colored dress she had worn to the charity luncheon. "Everyone expects me to wear something extraordinary," she admitted. Ethan looked at the dress in her hands and smiled. "The most extraordinary thing about you has never been what you wear." A few days before the gala, Eleanor asked Savannah to join her in the old library. The elderly woman carefully opened the same wooden chest that had once held the forgotten wedding dress. This time she removed a folded letter, its edges softened by time. "Your grandfather wrote this for me before our wedding," Eleanor explained. Savannah unfolded the paper and quietly read the words. The letter spoke about choosing a person for the goodness in their heart rather than the applause of the world. Tears gathered in Savannah's eyes as Eleanor gently closed the chest. "The gala will not change who you are," the older woman said. "It will simply give the world a chance to see the woman I saw through that little shop window." On the night before the event, Savannah stood in front of the great mirrors one last time. She no longer searched for someone prettier, richer, or more important. For the first time, she simply smiled at the woman looking back, unaware that by the following evening an entire ballroom would rise to its feet, not because of the dress she wore, but because of the quiet grace she carried into the room. The night of the Callaway Foundation Gala arrived beneath a sky filled with thousands of quiet stars, and the grand ballroom overlooking the Charleston harbor glowed with soft golden light. Crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors while musicians played gentle melodies that floated through the room. Business leaders, artists, teachers, and volunteers gathered together, all waiting for the annual celebration to begin. Savannah Brooks stood upstairs in a quiet dressing room, holding the old handwritten letter Eleanor had shared with her only days before. She read one sentence again and again. "The world may admire beauty, but it remembers kindness." She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a small ivory handbag beside the simple necklace her grandmother had given her years ago. Designers had filled the room with elaborate gowns covered in sparkling details, but Savannah chose something different. She wore an elegant ivory dress with clean lines and soft fabric that moved naturally as she walked. There were no heavy jewels and no grand decorations. Looking into the mirror, she saw the same woman who had once stood inside a little bridal shop wearing a forgotten dress that nobody wanted. The difference was not in the reflection. The difference was in the way she finally looked at herself. Downstairs, Ethan waited near the entrance with Eleanor by his side. Vanessa and several guests quietly watched the staircase, expecting Savannah to make another awkward appearance among people who lived very different lives. The music softened as the ballroom doors opened. Savannah stepped forward slowly, and for a brief moment the entire room became completely silent. She was not the most richly dressed person there, and she was not trying to be. Yet there was a calm confidence in the way she carried herself that seemed to fill the room with warmth. Ethan looked at her and smiled, not because she looked different, but because she looked free. As they walked together through the ballroom, people who had never spoken to Savannah before approached her to thank her for the reading programs and small business projects she had helped create through the foundation. Teachers introduced her to their students. Volunteers thanked her for listening to their ideas. Elderly guests spoke about the kindness she had shown them during community visits. Vanessa watched in disbelief. She had expected people to admire Savannah because she married a billionaire. Instead, they admired her because of the person she had become. The evening reached its most important moment when Eleanor slowly walked onto the stage to present the annual Community Heart Award. Everyone expected the honor to go to a famous donor or successful business leader. Eleanor looked across the ballroom and smiled gently. "Many people believe greatness is measured by wealth or status," she began. But my husband taught me that the strongest people are often the ones who quietly help others without asking for recognition. She paused before continuing. This year's award belongs to my granddaughter by marriage, Savannah Calloway. The entire ballroom stood to its feet. Applause filled the hall as Savannah looked around in complete surprise. Tears gathered in her eyes while she slowly walked toward the stage. She accepted the award with trembling hands and looked at the crowd. I spent most of my life believing I was ordinary, she said softly. But someone once told me that kindness is the rarest beauty in the world. If I have done anything worth celebrating, it is only because people believed in me before I believed in myself. When she finished speaking, Ethan quietly joined her on the stage. He took her hand and looked at the crowd before speaking the truth he had carried in his heart from the very beginning. People say that I turned my wife into a princess, he said with a gentle smile. The truth is much simpler. She was always extraordinary. I only helped the world notice what was already there. As the applause rose once more beneath the golden lights, Savannah reached into her handbag and gently touched the old letter, realizing that the forgotten girl from the bakery had never disappeared. She had simply been waiting for the courage to see herself the way others already did. The morning after the gala, newspapers across Charleston carried photographs of Savannah Calloway standing beside teachers, volunteers, and children rather than celebrities or wealthy investors. The headlines spoke about the woman who had captured the heart of the city's most respected family not through glamour, but through kindness. Savannah woke early as usual and walked quietly into the kitchen, expecting everything to feel different after the night that had changed so much. Instead, she found the cooks preparing breakfast, the sunlight pouring through the windows, and the smell of fresh bread filling the room. Without thinking, she tied on an old bakery apron and began kneading dough. One of the younger kitchen assistants smiled and asked, "Mrs. Calloway, after last night, why are you still doing this?" Savannah simply laughed. "Because this is where I learned that love can be mixed into simple things." Ethan stood in the doorway listening to her answer. In that moment, he understood that no ballroom or award could ever change the person she truly was. During the following weeks, letters began arriving at the Calloway estate from all over the state. Some came from young girls who felt invisible at school. Others came from women who had spent years believing they would never be enough because they did not fit the world's idea of beauty. Savannah read every letter carefully. Many of them reminded her of the young woman who had once stood inside a little bridal shop wearing a forgotten dress. She decided she could not simply put the letters away and move on. Working together with the Calloway Foundation, she created a small community program that offered free baking classes, reading groups, and mentorship opportunities for young women who needed encouragement more than anything else. Ethan quietly supported every idea, but never placed his own name at the center of the project. "This belongs to you," he told her. "You built it with your own heart." One Saturday afternoon, the first group gathered inside an old community center near the bakery where Savannah had once worked. The room was simple, decorated with fresh flowers and shelves of donated books. Among the visitors was the same little girl who had asked Savannah how she became a princess. The child walked up carrying a handmade drawing. It showed a woman wearing an apron and holding a loaf of bread, while a small crown rested gently above her head. "I made this for you," the little girl said. Savannah looked at the picture and smiled through tears. "Why does she have a crown?" she asked softly. The child thought for a moment before answering. "Because she helps people feel special." Savannah hugged her gently and placed the drawing beside the old handwritten letter Eleanor had given her. That evening, she returned to the mirror room carrying both treasures. The mirrors reflected countless images around her, but she no longer searched for flaws. She looked at the little drawing, then at the woman standing before her. Ethan quietly entered the room and stood beside her. "Do you remember what you told that little girl?" he asked. Savannah smiled. "I told her that kindness is something nobody can take away." Ethan nodded. "That is why everyone stood up for you at the gala. Not because you became someone new, but because you reminded them of the person they hoped to become." Savannah reached out and touched the mirror one last time. She remembered the frightened young baker who had once believed she did not belong in a world of grand houses and elegant people. That girl was still there, but now she understood something she had never known before. A real princess was not created by a beautiful dress, a famous family, or a crown of gold. She was created by the quiet courage to help others see their own worth, even when she had once struggled to see it in herself. Several months passed, and the little community program Savannah had started grew into something far greater than anyone expected. The old building beside the bakery became a place where children discovered books, where young women learned new skills, and where people who had once felt forgotten found encouragement. Every Saturday morning the rooms filled with laughter, the smell of fresh bread, and stories shared over long wooden tables. Savannah never sat behind a grand office desk. She stood beside everyone else with flour on her hands, greeting each visitor as though they were family. One quiet afternoon, after the last guests had gone home, Eleanor asked Savannah and Ethan to join her in the old library. The elderly woman walked slowly toward the wooden chest that had become a part of so many important moments in their lives. Inside rested the faded handwritten letter, the simple necklace from Savannah's grandmother, and a carefully folded piece of white lace from the forgotten wedding dress. Eleanor smiled as she looked at them. "There is one last thing I want you to have," she said. She reached beneath the box and removed a small silver hand mirror. Time had softened its edges, but the glass remained perfectly clear. "Your grandfather gave this to me when we had almost nothing," she explained. "Whenever life became difficult, he would tell me to look into it, and remember that the strongest people rarely know how extraordinary they truly are." She placed the mirror into Savannah's hands. Tears quietly filled Savannah's eyes as she held it. That evening, after returning home, she walked alone into the mirror room one final time. The golden light of sunset flowed through the glass ceiling, covering the walls with warmth. She placed the old letter, the little girl's drawing, and the silver mirror beside one another. Then she looked at her own reflection. She saw the same dark curls, the same gentle eyes, and the same quiet smile that had always been there. She remembered the frightened baker who believed she did not belong. She remembered the forgotten wedding dress that nobody wanted. She remembered standing in this very room wishing she could become someone else. Slowly, she picked up the silver mirror and looked into it. For the first time in her life, she realized there had never been anything wrong with the girl staring back at her. The only thing she had been missing was the courage to believe her own worth. Ethan quietly entered the room and stopped beside her. He noticed the tears in her eyes and gently asked, "What do you see?" Savannah smiled, not with sadness, but with peace. "I see the girl who thought she needed to become a princess," she answered softly. "And I see the woman who finally understands she never had to." Ethan took her hand, and together they looked at the countless reflections surrounding them. There were no crowns, no grand titles, and no applause inside that quiet room. Only two people who had learned that love does not change who someone is. It simply gives them the safety to become themselves. Outside, the evening bells of Charleston echoed through the streets while the lights of the little bakery glowed softly in the distance. The forgotten wedding dress remained carefully preserved inside the wooden chest, no longer as a symbol of a girl nobody chose, but as a reminder that the most beautiful stories begin when someone dares to see value where the world sees none. And as Savannah looked one last time into the mirror before leaving the room, she realized that the greatest transformation of all had never been from an ordinary girl into a princess. It had been from self-doubt into self-love, and that was a crown no one could ever take away.